Rosalie Harper hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in nearly 6 months. By day, she cleaned offices. By evening, she waited tables. By night, she sat beside her 8-year-old son's hospital bed, praying the next phone call from the doctor wouldn't be the one that shattered her world. Every dollar she earned already belonged to someone else: the landlord, the pharmacy, the hospital. So when she spotted an expensive black leather wallet lying beside a rain-soaked bus stop, she picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was enough cash to change her life, enough to pay the rent, enough to buy groceries, enough to keep the lights on, enough to help save her little boy. For one brief moment, she closed her eyes. No one had seen her pick it up. No one would ever know. Then she thought of her son. She smiled sadly, snapped the wallet shut, and whispered, "I'd rather be poor than become someone he could never be proud of." What Rosalie didn't know was that the wallet belonged to the most feared Mafia boss in the city. And the moment she knocked on his front door to return it, she unknowingly walked into a world of power, danger, and secrets. Because Damien Moretti wasn't just searching for his missing wallet. He was searching for the one person he could finally trust. And before this story was over, a struggling single mother would become the most important woman in his life. Before we go back and watch Rosalie make that choice for herself, if you believe honesty should still mean something, even when no one's watching, hit subscribe, because this story is about to prove exactly why it does. And tell me in the comments. Be honest. If you found $18,000 in cash with no ID in sight, and no one would ever know, would you have done what Rosalie did? Type, "I'd return it," below, if you already know you'd have made the same choice she did. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a rain-soaked bus stop, and the moment that changed 2 lives forever. The paper star sat crooked on Noah's nightstand, one wing shorter than the other, folded by small hands that hadn't quite mastered the last crease. "You're going to be late," Rosalie said, tugging her cardigan closed against the evening chill seeping through their apartment's thin walls. "One more." Noah didn't look up, tongue poking out in concentration as he pressed a final fold into the paper. He'd been making them since he was 5, ever since a nurse at the hospital taught him during a long night of tests, telling him stars were for wishing people home safely. He'd never stopped believing it. There. Done. He held it out to her, small and lopsided and perfect. "For luck," he said. "So you come home." Rosalie's throat tightened the way it always did when her son handed her his whole heart folded into paper. She tucked the star into her coat pocket, right over where it would sit against her chest all night. "Always do, baby." She kissed his forehead, careful of the faint blue tinge that still shadowed his lips when he got tired. The small reminder she carried everywhere that her son's heart didn't work quite like other children's. "Mrs. Fenwick's got you tonight. Be good. I'm always good. You told her ghost stories until midnight last time." "That's called entertainment, Mom." She laughed, despite the exhaustion sitting heavy behind her eyes, despite the overdue rent notice taped to the refrigerator that she'd been carefully not looking at for 2 days, despite the stack of hospital bills in a drawer she couldn't bring herself to open without her hands shaking. 8 years old, and already the bravest person she knew. She left before he could see her face change. 2 miles across the city, in a study lined with dark wood and old money, Damien Moretti watched one of his men flinch under a silence that had gone on 4 seconds too long. "You frightened a child," Damien said, quiet in the way that made grown men more afraid than shouting ever could, during a collection that should have taken 10 minutes. "Boss, the kid startled me. I didn't mean. There is one rule in this organization that does not bend." Damien's dark eyes didn't blink. "Children are never targets, never witnesses to fear, never collateral. You will apologize to that family personally, and you will not go near that house again." The man left considerably paler than he'd arrived. Luca, arms crossed by the door, waited until the room emptied before speaking. "He's rattled." "He should be." You've gotten stricter about that rule lately. Damien didn't answer, returning his attention to the ledger open on his desk, though his eyes didn't quite focus on the numbers. He'd inherited an empire built by men who saw children as leverage, as means to an end, and he had spent 14 years quietly, deliberately unbuilding that particular cruelty, one rule at a time. Mrs. Rossi appeared in the doorway without knocking, the way only she was permitted to. "You've been in this office since 6 this morning." She set a cup of tea on his desk with the unshakable authority of a woman who'd been managing this household, and this man, since he was 12 years old. "You'll ruin your eyes before you ruin your marriage prospects. And God knows which one worries me more. I don't have marriage prospects, Agatha. Not with that attitude." She patted his shoulder on her way out, entirely unbothered by his glare. "Drink your tea." He drank his tea. He did not notice, until considerably later that night, that his wallet was missing from his coat pocket, lost somewhere between the car and the curb outside a downtown restaurant, in the kind of careless 5 minutes a man in his position could rarely afford. Rosalie found it an hour later, half soaked from rain, lying beside the bus stop bench where she waited every night for the last transfer home. Black leather, heavier than it looked. She turned it over once in her hands, some instinct telling her it belonged to someone with considerably more money than the thin bus schedule pinned to the shelter beside her. She opened it. Her breath caught. Cash, more than she'd seen in one place in years, folded thick against black cards embossed with names she didn't recognize but understood, somehow, meant power. No driver's license. No visible ID at all. Only a folded photograph tucked behind the cash, corners soft with age, of a man and woman she didn't know, smiling at a camera decades old. Enough cash to cover 3 months of overdue rent. Enough to pay off the hospital's collections department, the one that called every Tuesday at exactly 4 p.m., the one whose voice she now recognized before they finished saying hello. Enough, possibly, to buy Noah more time. She sat down on the wet bench, the wallet heavy in her lap, and let herself imagine it, just for a moment. The lights that wouldn't get shut off, the fridge that wouldn't sit half empty, the look on Noah's face if she came home with real groceries instead of whatever the discount bin offered that week. No one had seen her pick it up. The street was empty, rain slicked and silent. No one would ever know. She closed her eyes. Then she thought of Noah, not the sick, tired version who needed her strength, but the version who folded paper stars because he genuinely believed they kept people safe, who looked at her like she'd built the whole world by hand. What kind of world would she be handing him if this was how she built it? She opened her eyes, snapped the wallet shut, and whispered to the empty street, "I'd rather be poor than become someone he could never be proud of." There was a name stitched faintly into the leather lining, an address embossed on a small card tucked in the fold. She had no money for a cab. She walked. The gates of the Moretti estate rose out of the rain like something from a different world entirely. Iron scrollwork, 20 feet high, stone pillars, a driveway longer than her entire apartment block. Rosalie stood at the gate, in her damp cardigan, wallet clutched in both hands, feeling smaller than she had in years. 2 men in dark suits stepped forward before she'd even reached the intercom, hands hovering near their jackets in a way that made her stomach drop. "This is private property," one said. "I found this." She held up the wallet, voice steadier than she felt. "I think it belongs to someone who lives here." The men exchanged a look she couldn't read. "Wait here." She waited, rain soaking through her sleeves, for what felt like a very long time, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, wondering if the smart thing would have been to simply mail it, wondering why some part of her had needed to hand it back in person, needed to see this through to the end herself. The gates finally groaned open. A man walked toward her from the house, tall, dark-suited, moving like every step had been calculated in advance. And something about his face, half-shadowed in the porch light behind him, made every one of the two guards straighten instantly to attention. Rosalie's stomach dropped for an entirely different reason. She didn't know his name yet, but she understood, with sudden and complete certainty, exactly what kind of man she'd just knocked on the door of. "You're the one who called about the wallet," Damien said, stopping several feet away, his eyes assessing her with a thoroughness that made her want to fold her arms across her damp cardigan. "I didn't call. I walked." She held it out, rain dripping from her sleeve. "It's all here. I didn't count it, but I didn't take anything either, if that's what you're wondering." "I wasn't wondering that. Everyone wonders that." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close. He took the wallet slowly, and instead of opening it to the cash the way she'd expected, his thumb went straight to the fold at the back, checking for the photograph first. It was still there. Rosalie watched something in his shoulders loosen, some tension she hadn't realized he was carrying until it visibly left him. "My parents," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I don't have many pictures left of them." "I figured it mattered more than the cash." She shrugged, self-conscious now under his attention. "Photographs don't come back if you spend them." He looked up at her then, really looked, in a way that made her suddenly, acutely aware of her worn shoes and the rain in her hair and the fact that she hadn't slept properly in months. Most people would have kept the money. Most people don't have an 8-year-old asking what they did today. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them, quieter than she meant. "I'd rather be broke and look him in the eye than fix everything with money that wasn't mine. My son deserves a mother he can be proud of." Silence stretched between them, the rain filling the space where neither of them spoke. "Thank you," Damien said finally, formal again, though something in his voice had changed. "I'd like to compensate you for your honesty. I didn't return it for a reward. I'm aware. That's precisely why I'm offering one." A ghost of dry humor crossed his face. "You've made this considerably more complicated than it needed to be." "You're welcome." She managed a tired smile. "I should get home. Long walk back." He didn't offer a car. Not yet. Some instinct telling him she'd refuse it exactly as firmly as she'd nearly refused to take a cent of his money. He simply watched her go, down the long drive, through the gates, into the rain-soaked dark, with an expression Mrs. Rossi, appearing silently at his shoulder, recognized instantly. "She's trouble," the old woman said, not unkindly. "No," Damien said, still watching the empty street where Rosalie had disappeared. "She's honest." Mrs. Rossi's eyebrows rose, but she said nothing further, filing the moment away, the way she filed away every small crack in the careful armor Damien had worn since he was 22 years old. Damien turned back toward the house, wallet still in hand, already reaching for his phone. Luca. His head of security appeared within seconds, as though he'd been waiting just out of sight the entire time. "Boss?" Damien's eyes lingered a moment longer on the empty gate. "Find out everything about her." The report landed on Damien's desk 2 days later, thin enough that he almost mistook it for incomplete. It wasn't incomplete. There was simply nothing to hide. Rosalie Harper, 33. 2 jobs. Office cleaning by day, waitressing most evenings. Occasional weekend shifts filling in wherever the schedule left gaps. No criminal record. No debts owed to anyone dangerous. Only the ordinary, crushing kind. Rent 3 weeks overdue. A stack of medical bills routed through 4 different collection agencies. A credit score that told a story of a woman perpetually 1 bad week from losing everything. And Noah Harper, age 8. A congenital heart defect that required ongoing specialist care she could barely afford on 2 minimum-wage jobs combined. Damien read the medical summary twice, something tightening in his chest he didn't examine too closely. She'd stood in the rain with $18,000 in her hands and walked it back to him anyway. "You're staring at that file like it insulted you," Luca observed from the doorway. "She sold her television last month. To pay for his medication." Damien closed the folder, and she still walked the money back. Some people are just built that way, boss. Not people I've met. He didn't tell Luca to stand down the investigation. He also didn't tell him to escalate it. Not surveillance. Nothing that crossed the line between concern and intrusion. Just enough to know, quietly, that she made it home safely each night. That the man from the collections agency didn't show up at her door in person. That whatever burdens she carried them without anyone standing close enough to help. He found himself, 3 days later, in a part of the city he had no legitimate reason to visit, watching through a diner window as Rosalie balanced 4 plates on one arm and still managed a warm smile for a table of tired construction workers who tipped in loose change. He hadn't planned to go inside. He went inside anyway. Noah was doing homework at the counter when Damien found an excuse. Thin, transparent, utterly unconvincing even to himself, to linger past ordering coffee he didn't particularly want. "That's not going to work," the boy said, not looking up from a worksheet covered in fractions. "Excuse me? Your tie's crooked. If you're trying to look like you belong here, the tie's a dead giveaway." Noah finally glanced up, sizing Damien with the frank, unfiltered assessment only children seemed capable of. "You're the wallet guy." "I am. Mom said you were scary." "Am I?" Noah considered this seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything. "You don't look scary. You look tired, like Mom looks." Something in Damien's chest cracked slightly at that, unprompted and unwelcome. "What's the fraction problem? I don't get denominators." 20 minutes later, Damien Moretti, feared by 3 rival families, a man who had ended arguments with a single look for over a decade, sat hunched over a diner counter, methodically explaining fractions to an 8-year-old using sugar packets as visual aids, while Rosalie watched from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite school into neutrality. "He's good with him," Mrs. Rossi said later that evening, when Damien recounted the afternoon with more detail than he'd intended, trying to sound casual and failing entirely. "I only helped with homework. You fixed his broken toy robot last week too. Don't think I didn't hear about that from Luca." Mrs. Rossi's eyes glinted with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching her predictions come true. "Careful, Damien. That little boy already looks at you like a hero. I'm not anyone's hero. Tell that to the fractions." Damien didn't have a response for that. He simply drank his tea and did not examine too closely why the warmth in his chest hadn't faded since he'd left the diner. The black SUV appeared behind Rosalie's bus 3 nights later, matching its speed exactly, turning when it turned, for 6 blocks straight. She noticed on the 4th block, old habits from a childhood spent watching which adults to trust and which to avoid, and kept her breathing steady, her eyes forward, while every instinct she owned screamed that something was deeply wrong. She got off 2 stops early, cutting through a lit parking lot instead of her usual dark shortcut, and didn't stop walking until she reached her building's front door with her key already in hand. The SUV didn't follow into the lot. It simply idled at the curb for a long moment, headlights cutting through the dark, before pulling away into traffic and disappearing. Rosalie stood on her own doorstep, heart hammering, telling herself it was nothing, a wrong turn, a coincidence, the kind of thing city living made you paranoid about, even when it meant nothing at all. She didn't quite believe herself. The rent notice disappeared from her refrigerator door on a Tuesday. Rosalie stood staring at the blank space where it had hung for 2 weeks, then called her landlord, who informed her, with visible confusion, that her account showed paid in full, 3 months, cleared that morning, no note attached. Her stomach dropped. The hospital called the next day, not the collections department, whose voice she knew better than her own mother's, but the billing office directly, informing her that Noah's outstanding balance had been resolved by an anonymous donor. Anonymous, she repeated into the phone, already knowing. By Friday, groceries arrived at her door, real groceries, fresh produce and meat she hadn't been able to afford in months, delivered by a service she'd never used, paid for by an account she couldn't trace. She marched to the Moretti estate that same evening, soaked through from rain again, considerably angrier than the last time she'd stood at those gates. "I don't want your charity," she told him, before he'd even fully opened the study door. "I don't recall offering any. My rent, the hospital, the groceries I definitely did not order." She crossed her arms. "You think because I returned a wallet, I'm now a project you can fix?" "I think," Damien said, unhurried, "that a good woman has been drowning for months, while everyone around her looked away, and I had the means to stop it." "That's not your job. I don't like seeing good people lose. I am not a charity case, Damien Moretti." "No," he agreed, something softening in his face. "You're the most honest person I've met in 14 years. I'd like to keep it that way. And it's difficult to stay honest when you're choosing between medicine and dinner." Rosalie opened her mouth to argue further, and found, infuriatingly, that nothing came out. His logic was maddening precisely because it wasn't wrong, and the tenderness underneath it was harder to fight than any argument would have been. "You're impossible," she said instead, weaker than she intended. "Yet here you are." Despite herself, despite the rent and the groceries, and every instinct telling her to stay guarded, the corner of her mouth twitched upward. "I'm still returning the money. You can try." She left 20 minutes later, without having resolved anything, without a single dollar returned, feeling considerably less angry than she'd arrived, and considerably more confused about why. She got home to find her apartment door unlocked. Her breath caught. She was certain, absolutely certain, she'd locked it that morning, the way she locked it every single day, out of a habit older than Noah himself. She stepped inside slowly, pulse hammering, scanning the small living room for anything out of place. Nothing was stolen. The television, second-hand and barely functional, still sat in its corner. Noah's school books were exactly where he'd left them. Her jewelry box, meager as it was, sat untouched on her dresser. But the drawer where she kept her paperwork, bills, old letters, the folder of medical documents she guarded like something sacred, had been opened. Papers sat slightly askew, not ransacked, searched. Someone had gone through her things with careful, deliberate hands, looking for something specific, and left everything else precisely as they'd found it. Rosalie stood in the middle of her living room, heart pounding, and reached for her phone with shaking hands. She had only one number in mind to call. Damien arrived at her apartment within 20 minutes, faster than should have been possible across that stretch of city traffic, Luca and 2 more men flanking him before he'd even reached her door. "Nothing's missing," Rosalie said, before he could ask, arms wrapped around herself in the doorway. "They searched. They didn't take." Damien's jaw tightened as he stepped past her, scanning the room with the same methodical care his men used, though she suspected he was seeing something entirely different in the details than she was. "They were looking for something specific," he said finally. "Looking for what? I don't have anything worth breaking in for." Damien didn't answer immediately. He crossed to the drawer she'd pointed out, examining the disturbed papers with a focus that made her stomach twist. "The wallet," he said slowly. "Before you returned it, did you look through everything inside? The documents, not just the cash." Rosalie thought back to that rain-soaked bench, the trembling in her hands, the photograph of his parents. There was a folded paper behind the cards. "I didn't read it. I wasn't going through your private business, Damien. I was just—" "You touched it. I barely glanced at it." "That's enough." His voice had gone flat, controlled in the particular way she was beginning to recognize meant he was furious and refusing to show it. He turned to Luca. "Get the analysts on the documents that were in my wallet that night. Every page. I want to know exactly what was in that folder." The answer came within the hour, delivered in a hushed conversation Damien had in the hallway, while Rosalie sat on her own couch, feeling increasingly like a stranger in her own life. "It's bad, boss," Luca said, not quite quiet enough. "That folder had evidence. Embezzlement, Castellano money laundered through 3 shell accounts, with 2 city officials named directly. If it surfaces, it takes down half their operation and exposes people who thought they were untouchable. And they think she has a copy. They think anyone who touched it might. Damien returned to the living room, and Rosalie watched something settle behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, but a grim, focused resolve she recognized from the night he'd first walked toward her at his gates. "You and Noah are coming to the estate," he said. "Tonight." "Absolutely not. Rosalie, I am not uprooting my son's entire life because someone searched my apartment drawer. He has school. He has a routine. His whole world is stable in exactly the ways it needs to be for his heart condition. Someone broke into your home, looking for evidence that could get you killed." Damien's voice cracked, just slightly, the first real fracture she'd seen in his composure since the night at the bus stop. "I am asking you to let me protect you both. Please." The words, "please," landed harder than any command could have. Rosalie looked at him, really looked, past the suits and the guards and the empire he ran with an iron grip, and saw, underneath it all, a man genuinely terrified of losing something he'd only just found. "Noah can't know what's really happening," she said quietly. "He gets scared easily. His heart. He'll be safe. I promise you that." She nodded, slowly, the fight draining out of her all at once. The estate absorbed them the way it seemed to absorb everything, quietly, thoroughly, with a competence that left no room for question. Noah's eyes went wide at the sheer size of the house, at the sweeping staircase, at Mrs. Rossi's immediate, enthusiastic fussing over whether he'd eaten dinner. "You're staying in the guest wing," Mrs. Rossi told Rosalie, already bustling toward the stairs, with Noah's small backpack slung over one shoulder, like she'd been waiting years for a child to fuss over. "And you, young man, I have a very serious question. Do you like chess?" "I don't know how to play." "Well," Mrs. Rossi's eyes sparkled, "we'll fix that." Rosalie watched her son disappear up the stairs, already chattering happily about chess pieces and paper stars, and whether the mansion had a dog, and felt something in her chest ease for the first time in days. Damien found her on the terrace an hour later, staring out at gardens lit gold by evening light. "Thank you," she said, without turning, "for making this feel less terrifying than it is." "You don't have to thank me." "I do. You didn't have to do any of this. The rent, the hospital, now this." She finally looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet a long moment, the kind of silence she'd learned meant he was choosing his words with unusual care. "Because you looked at $18,000 you desperately needed and chose to be someone your son could be proud of," he said. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who'd sell anyone for considerably less. You're the first honest thing I've had in this world, since my parents died." Rosalie's breath caught. Before she could answer, before either of them could close the distance that had been slowly, quietly shrinking between them for weeks, Mrs. Rossi's voice cut sharply through the terrace door. "Damien!" Something in her tone made both of them turn instantly. "Noah's missing!" The words hit Rosalie like a physical blow. "What do you mean missing?" "He was upstairs, he was playing chess. He asked to use the bathroom." Mrs. Rossi's face had gone pale, her usual composure cracked wide open. "I checked 10 minutes later. He wasn't there. The window in the hall bathroom was open." Rosalie was already moving, sprinting through the house toward the stairs, Noah's name tearing out of her throat before she'd even reached the second floor. Damien caught up to her at the guest wing, his men already fanning out across the estate grounds, radios crackling with clipped, urgent updates. "He's not on the property," Luca reported within minutes, his voice tight. "Gate log shows no vehicles in or out in the last hour, which means someone got inside my perimeter." Damien's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Check the outer wall. Every camera now." Rosalie stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the open bathroom window, at the small scuff marks on the sill that could only have come from someone lifting a small, frightened boy through it against his will. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I brought him here. I brought him into this. This is not your fault." Damien's hands found her shoulders, steady despite the fury radiating off him. "Look at me. We will find him." "How? You don't know where." His phone rang. The entire hallway went silent. Damien answered on the first ring, jaw set, and put it on speaker without being asked, his eyes never leaving Rosalie's face. Moretti, a man's voice, unfamiliar, calm in a way that made Rosalie's stomach turn to ice. "We have something of yours, or rather, something of hers. If you touch that boy, he's fine. Scared, understandably, but fine. For now." A pause, deliberate, cruel. "We're not interested in money, Damien. You've made that boring for us. We want you. A trade. You for the boy, and we'll consider the matter of your late accountant's missing documents finally settled." The line went dead before Damien could respond. Rosalie's knees nearly buckled. Damien caught her before she fell, one arm wrapping around her as the hallway seemed to tilt sideways beneath her feet. "They have him," she whispered. "They have my son." "I know." Damien's voice had gone somewhere colder and harder than she'd ever heard it. The voice, she realized, of a man about to burn down anything standing between himself and getting a child home safely. "Luca, boss?" They broke the only rule that matters. Damien's dark eyes had gone flat, absolute. "Children are never targets. What's the plan?" "We find him." Damien turned, already moving toward the stairs, pulling his phone back out, voice sharp with commands to men Rosalie couldn't see. "Pull every camera within 6 blocks of this house. Every associate connected to the Castellano operation. I want eyes on every warehouse, every safe house, every property those documents ever touched." Rosalie followed him down the stairs on unsteady legs, gripping the banister hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Noah's small paper star still tucked inside her coat pocket, where it had been since she'd left work that first rainy night. "For luck," he'd told her. "So you come home." She pressed her hand flat against her chest, against the crumpled paper beneath her coat, and made herself a promise fiercer than any fear she'd ever known. Whatever it took, whatever this house, this man, this dangerous world required of her, she was bringing her son home. The warehouse sat at the edge of the docks, windows boarded over with warped plywood, the kind of building the city had long since stopped bothering to remember. Rust bled down its corrugated walls in long orange streaks, and the single working floodlight above its loading door flickered like it, too, wanted no part of what was about to happen inside. Damien walked toward it alone, unarmed, hands visible, exactly as the voice on the phone had instructed. It was the hardest walk of his life. Behind him, 2 blocks back in the shadow of a shipping container, Rosalie stood pressed against cold metal, with Luca's hand firm on her shoulder, both of them watching through field glasses as Damien crossed the open lot toward the warehouse's loading door. "He shouldn't be going in there alone," she whispered. "He's not alone. He's just the only one they can see." Luca's voice was low, controlled, though his knuckles had gone white around the glasses. 6 men are already inside the perimeter fence, 3 more on the roof access. He wanted it to look clean for them. It won't stay that way. That doesn't make me feel better. It's not meant to. It's meant to be true. Rosalie said nothing further, her whole body a taut wire of fear, her eyes locked on the warehouse door as it swallowed Damien whole. Inside, the air smelled of salt water and motor oil and something colder underneath it. Fear, maybe, or the particular stillness of men who did this kind of business often enough to have stopped feeling anything about it. A dozen figures stood scattered across the concrete floor, illuminated by a single work light hanging from the rafters, and at the center of them, a man Damien recognized from Castellano's inner circle stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who believed every card in this game already belonged to him. "Moretti. Punctual. I respect that." The man spread his hands, almost friendly, given the circumstances. Where's the boy? Patience. The man's smile didn't waver. He's safe. Scared. Understandably. 8-year-olds don't handle strange men and dark rooms particularly well. But unharmed. You have my word. Your word means considerably less than you seem to think it does. The man's jaw tightened, just slightly, before he gestured to a side door. 2 guards emerged a moment later, dragging a small figure between them. Noah, pale and trembling, his eyes wide with a terror no child should ever have to wear, but alive, whole. The sight of him nearly broke every ounce of Damien's careful composure. "Let him go," Damien said. "Now then we discuss whatever it is you actually want. That's not how a trade works, Moretti. You know that better than most men in this city. I know that you called this a trade because you wanted leverage, not because you actually intend to release a witness who could identify half your operation." Damien's voice stayed level, controlled, though every instinct in him screamed to close the distance to Noah immediately. "So let's not pretend this ends with a handshake. Let the boy go, and I'll give you exactly 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have already buried this entire building." Something flickered in the man's eyes, the first real crack in his confidence. "You're bluffing." "Test it." The standoff stretched, taut and dangerous, every man in the warehouse suddenly aware that the balance of power in the room had shifted somewhere in the last 30 seconds without anyone quite noticing how. Then, the side door exploded inward. Damien's men poured through in a coordinated wave, precisely on the timeline he'd arranged the moment the ransom call ended. Smoke, gunfire, the deafening crack of flash grenades disorienting Castellano's men before they'd even registered the breach. Damien moved the instant chaos erupted, closing the distance to Noah in 3 long strides, shoving the boy behind an overturned pallet and covering him with his own body as bullets tore splinters from the wood above their heads. "Stay down," Damien said, voice steady despite his pulse hammering. "I've got you. I promise you, Noah, I've got you." Noah's small hands fisted into Damien's jacket, shaking violently, but he didn't scream, didn't bolt, just held on with the complete, desperate trust of a child who had already decided, somewhere in the last few weeks, that this man was safe. Outside, Rosalie had stopped being able to stand still the moment the shooting started. "Rosalie, wait!" Luca's hand closed around her arm, but she was already moving, twisting free with a strength born entirely of panic, sprinting for the side entrance while he swore behind her and radioed for cover. She reached the doorway just as a guard rounded the corner toward her, weapon raised, and froze, every nerve in her body screaming, until one of Damien's men dropped him from behind with brutal efficiency before he could fire. "Inside! Go! Go!" the man shouted, and Rosalie didn't need telling twice. She found them behind the pallet, Damien's shoulder dark and wet, where a round had grazed him, Noah pressed against his chest, both of them alive. "Mom!" "I'm here, baby. I'm here." She dropped to her knees, pulling her son into her arms with a sob that tore straight from her chest, while Damien kept his body angled protectively around them both, watching the warehouse floor with the sharp, focused calm of a man who hadn't yet allowed himself to feel anything but the job in front of him. "We need to move," he said. "Luca's clearing the east exit. Now." Another round struck the crate beside them, close enough that splinters rained across Noah's hair. Rosalie screamed, curling her body over her son on instinct, and Damien threw himself forward, without a second's hesitation, absorbing the space between his family and the gunfire. They made it to the east exit in a controlled, desperate sprint, Damien's men falling into disciplined formation around them, laying down cover fire in careful, practiced bursts until the heavy door slammed shut behind them, and the cold night air hit their lungs like something new. Mrs. Rossi was already waiting on the estate's front steps when they arrived, wringing a dish towel in both hands, and the sound she made when Noah ran into her open arms was somewhere between a sob and a prayer. "You beautiful, brave boy," she murmured into his hair, rocking him gently. You beautiful, brave boy. You're safe now. You're home. Damien stood at the edge of the driveway, breathing hard, watching Rosalie hold her son like she'd never once let go again, and allowed himself, finally, to feel the full weight of how close he'd come to failing the only promise that had ever truly mattered. Luca approached quietly a few minutes later, a folder tucked under one arm, his expression grim enough that Damien's relief curdled instantly into dread. "Boss, we pulled documents from the warehouse office during the breach." Luca's jaw was tight. "You need to see this before anyone else does." Damien opened the folder beneath the porch light and felt something cold settle deep into his chest as he read the name attached to a year's worth of wire transfers that had quietly, methodically fed information straight into Castellano's hands. Not a stranger. Not an outside threat he could simply eliminate and move past. Someone who had sat at his own table for over a decade. "It can't be him," Damien said quietly, staring at the name typed cleanly at the top of the page, refusing, for one full moment, to let the truth land. "The trail's clean, boss. Timestamps match every leak we've had over the past year, right down to the day Rosalie returned your wallet." Luca's voice was careful, quiet with the particular gentleness of a man delivering news he knew would cut deep. "He's the one who told Castellano's people she might have copied the documents. He's the reason any of this happened." Damien closed the folder slowly, his face going very still. The stillness Rosalie had learned, over these past weeks, meant something dangerous was moving beneath the surface. He found the man an hour later in the estate's east office, going through paperwork with the same unbothered calm he'd worn for 11 years of Sunday dinners, birthday parties, quiet counsel offered late into countless nights. "You searched her apartment," Damien said, closing the door behind him with a click that seemed to echo through the whole room. "You told Castellano's people she might have copies of my documents. You put a child in that warehouse tonight." The man's composure cracked instantly, color draining from his face. "Damien, I can explain. You'd better make it good. They were going to expose the embezzlement regardless. I was trying to control the damage, trying to protect the organization we built. Protect you?" His voice rose, desperate now, the mask of 11 years dissolving in real time. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant for the boy." "You sold a child's safety for a payout," Damien said, voice gone deadly quiet. "And now you want me to believe you did it out of loyalty." What followed was brief, and it was brutal, and it left no room for whatever excuse the man had still been reaching for. By the time Luca's men had him secured, the evidence trail thorough enough to guarantee decades behind bars alongside conspiracy and embezzlement charges that would finally see daylight, the Castellano operation had already begun collapsing under the weight of documents Damien released, carefully and precisely, to exactly the investigators and journalists who couldn't be bought or silenced twice. The rival family's grip on the east side of the city crumbled within the week, taking 2 corrupt officials down with it. Noah was safe. The threat, finally, entirely, was gone. But the warehouse had cost Damien more than he'd let anyone see in the chaos of the rescue, a bullet grazing far closer to his ribs than the shoulder wound suggested, one he'd hidden through sheer stubborn will until he collapsed in the hallway outside Rosalie's room 2 nights later, blood soaking dark through his shirt. "You absolute fool," Rosalie whispered, pressing towels hard against the wound with shaking hands, while Luca shouted for the estate's physician down the hall. "You threw yourself in front of bullets for my son, and didn't think to mention you were bleeding the entire drive home. Didn't want you to worry." His voice was thin, fading at the edges. "I am always going to worry about you, you impossible, stubborn man." Her voice cracked wide open, tears finally spilling free after days of holding herself together for Noah's sake, for everyone's sake but her own. "Don't you dare leave him now. Not after he's finally let himself trust someone again." Something in Damien's pain-glazed eyes softened at that, even as the room began to blur and fade around him. "Rosalie?" Don't talk. Save it. Save your strength for later, and you'd better have plenty left, because I have a great deal to say to you once you're not actively dying on my floor." He managed something that might have been a laugh, weak and short, before the physician arrived, and the room dissolved into efficient, controlled chaos. He recovered, in the end, though it took 3 days of fever, and Mrs. Rossi hovering at his bedside, with a ferocity that brooked no argument from anyone, physician included. "I've watched that boy become a man," Mrs. Rossi told Rosalie quietly on the second night, the two of them keeping vigil together in the dim, lamplit room, while Damien slept fitfully. 15 years since his parents died, and I have never once, not once, seen him let anyone close enough to matter." Her eyes glistened, catching the low light. "Until that boy of yours." Rosalie said nothing for a long moment, watching the slow rise and fall of Damien's chest, exhausted and terrified, and something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously, achingly close to love. That was precisely what frightened her most. Because she understood, sitting in that quiet room, exactly how completely Noah already adored this man. How he ran to Damien now, with his fractions homework, his chess questions, the small triumphant stories of his day. How thoroughly her son had begun to build his sense of safety around a man who lived, however carefully guarded, in a world of violence she had sworn her whole life to keep far from her child. And she knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what it cost a child to lose a father twice. She kissed Damien's forehead once he'd finally settled into a deep, peaceful sleep, safe, out of danger, and by morning, her room in the guest wing stood empty. On the nightstand, folded neatly beside Noah's abandoned chess set, sat a single handwritten letter addressed to Damien Moretti. The letter was 3 lines long, and it broke something in Damien that 4 days of fever and a bullet near his ribs never had. "I can't do this to Noah. He's already lost one father. I won't let him love a man who might not come home. I'm sorry. R." He was on his feet before Mrs. Rossi finished reading it over his shoulder, ignoring the sharp warning look from the physician still packing up his bag in the hallway. "Damien, you were nearly dead 3 days ago." "She's not getting on a bus out of this city without hearing me out first." He was already pulling a jacket over the bandages, jaw set in a way that made further argument pointless. "Luca, where?" "Bus terminal on 5th. Left an hour ago." Luca was already moving toward the car, keys in hand, no questions asked. "Boss, you can barely stand. Drive faster then." They found her on a bench outside the terminal, Noah asleep against her shoulder, a single duffel bag at her feet, holding everything they hadn't left behind. Which, Damien understood with a fresh ache, meant most of the estate's warmth had already been left behind on purpose. "You shouldn't be out of bed," Rosalie said, not looking up, her voice thin and careful in the way of someone who'd cried until there was nothing left to cry with. "You shouldn't be leaving without telling me why to my face." "I told you why. I wrote it down so I wouldn't have to watch your face while I said it." "Cowards move." Rosalie. That got her attention. Her head snapping up, eyes flashing with the fire he'd fallen for in the first place. "Excuse me? You survived 2 jobs, a sick child, and a city trying to kill you, and you're running from this. Because it's the first thing that might actually work." He lowered himself carefully onto the bench beside her, wincing, refusing her offered hand to steady him. "That's not protecting Noah. That's protecting yourself from hoping. He already calls you a hero." Her voice cracked. "If I let this become real, and then you don't come home one night, a bullet an inch to the left, a rival family with better aim, I will have handed my son a second grave to visit. I can't do that to him. I won't." "Mom?" Noah's voice, small and thick with sleep, cut between them. He'd been awake longer than either of them realized. "Mom, are we leaving him?" Rosalie's composure shattered entirely. "Baby, it's complicated. I don't want it to be complicated." Noah sat up, rubbing his eyes, looking between the 2 adults with the same frank, unfiltered clarity he'd once used to diagnose Damien's crooked tie. He taught me chess. He fixed my robot. He got shot for me. Mom? And you want to just leave? Noah. I already think of him as family. The boy's chin trembled, but he didn't look away. You always tell me the truth matters more than being scared. So I'm telling the truth. I don't want to go. Silence settled over the bench, broken only by the hiss of a departing bus at the far curb. Damien knelt in front of the boy, slow, careful of the bandages, but he did it anyway, and met him at eye level. I'm not asking to replace your father, Noah. I know I never could, and I wouldn't want to try. I'm only asking for the chance to become the kind of man you deserve to have around. However long that takes, however hard I have to work for it. Noah studied him with the same seriousness he gave every fraction problem, then turned to his mother. I think we should stay. Rosalie looked at her son, then at the man kneeling in front of them both, pale, bandaged, stubborn enough to check himself out of a sickbed rather than let her walk away without a fight, and felt the last of her resolve give quietly out from under her. I'm still scared, she admitted, barely above a whisper. I know. Damien reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. So am I. I've been scared since the night you handed my wallet back, and I realized I'd rather lose everything in it than lose you. She let out a wet, disbelieving laugh. That is, without question, the worst line I have ever heard. You're impossible. Yet here you are. The words came out soft, worn smooth from weeks of use, meaning something entirely different now than they had the first time. They didn't go back to the estate that night. Not yet. Damien insisted on walking them the 2 blocks to a small park near the terminal instead. The same one, Rosalie would later realize, close to the very bus stop where all of this had begun, though she didn't notice it that night. Too tired, too wrung out, too full of the fragile relief of a decision finally made. Noah fell asleep again on the walk, carried against Damien's uninjured shoulder, despite Rosalie's protests about his stitches. At the park bench, Damien set something down carefully in the shadow of the old oak tree. Small, easy to miss unless you were looking, before nodding for Luca to bring the car around. What was that? Rosalie asked. Nothing yet, Damien said. Go home, Rosalie. Rest. I'll see you both tomorrow. She didn't press. She was too tired, and something in his voice, quiet, deliberate, almost nervous in a way she'd never once heard from him, told her whatever it was mattered enough not to rush. Rosalie returned to the park the next afternoon, at Noah's insistence. He wanted to feed the ducks by the pond, he said, though she suspected Mrs. Rossi had orchestrated the outing with rather more intention than a bag of stale bread required. That was when she saw it. Sitting on the same bench, in the same spot, beneath the same old oak tree, a black leather wallet. Her breath caught. For one disoriented second she was back on that rain-soaked night, months ago, kneeling by a bus stop bench, her whole life about to change, and not yet knowing it. You have got, she said slowly, turning to find Damien standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, wearing an expression she'd never seen on him before, something almost bashful, entirely unguarded, to be the single worst person in this city at holding onto a wallet. Only when I need an excuse to see you. He nodded toward it. Open it. Her hands weren't quite steady as she picked it up, heavier than she remembered, the leather worn soft at the corners, in a way that told her this wasn't the same wallet at all, but one that had clearly been carried close for years. No cash inside. No black cards, no folded documents, no photograph tucked in the back fold. Only a ring, sitting in a small velvet slot, that had, she realized, been custom-fitted to hold exactly that and nothing else. Damien, I know what it costs you to let someone in. His voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. None of the calm command he wore like armor everywhere else. I know what it means that you're doing it anyway. I'm not offering you safety, because I can't promise that. Not honestly. Not in the world I live in. I'm offering you a life where you never again have to choose between honesty and survival. Where Noah never has to fold another paper star hoping the people he loves come home. Because I intend to be there every single time to prove he doesn't need to. Rosalie's eyes filled, the ring blurring gold and bright in her hands. Beside them, Noah had abandoned the ducks entirely, drifting closer with the particular stillness of a child who understood, without being told, that something important was happening. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small paper star, its wings slightly crooked, the fold not quite mastered even after all this time. "I don't need these anymore," he said, holding it out to Damien instead of his mother, for the first time in his life, "because I finally have my dad." Damien's composure, 14 years of careful, guarded control, broke entirely at that, and he crouched to take the small paper star with both hands, like it was something infinitely more valuable than anything that had ever passed through his actual wallet. "Only if you want to," he said, echoing the promise he'd made weeks ago, voice thick. "I already decided." Noah threw his arms around Damien's neck, and Damien held him back with the same fierce, unhesitating grip he'd used to shield the boy from gunfire. Only now there was nothing to protect him from, except the sheer, overwhelming size of being loved. Noah pulled back, grinning, and looked at his mother with the same frank clarity he'd used at a diner counter months ago. "I think we should keep him." Rosalie laughed through tears that refused to stop falling, closed the wallet gently around the ring, and said the only word that had ever felt this certain in her entire life. "Yes." Months later, sunlight spilled gold across the estate's back gardens, chairs arranged in careful rows beneath the same old oak that had somehow become the quiet heart of everything that mattered to them now. Mrs. Rossi cried openly through the entire ceremony, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she'd embroidered herself, muttering something about 15 years. To anyone who'd listen, Luca stood near the front in a suit that fit considerably better than his usual tactical gear, jaw tight, insisting to anyone who asked that he absolutely was not crying, while quite visibly crying. The adoption had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, quietly, in a courthouse with far less ceremony than the day deserved, Noah Harper becoming, officially and permanently, Noah Moretti, a name he'd tried out in the mirror for a full week afterward, grinning every single time. At the reception, as the last of the light faded gold over the gardens, Noah slipped between the tables, small and determined in his tiny borrowed tuxedo, and found Damien exactly where he knew he'd be, standing near the terrace, watching Rosalie laugh at something Mrs. Rossi had said, looking, for the first time in 14 years, entirely at peace. Noah reached into his pocket and produced one last paper star, its folds, finally, after months of practice, perfectly even. He tucked it gently into his father's suit pocket, right over his heart. "For luck," Noah said, echoing the words he'd once given only his mother. "So you always come home." Damien knelt, pulled his son into his arms, and looked past him, to where Rosalie now stood watching them both, her whole face lit with something that had taken a lifetime of hard nights to earn. They walked together into the last of the evening light, a family built not from blood, but from honesty, from a wallet returned in the rain, and from a paper star that had, against every impossible odds, finally brought everyone home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next unforgettable romance. And if you thought Damien and Rosalie's journey was emotional, just wait until you see what's coming next. Imagine a mafia boss so feared that his 2 vicious pit bulls have attacked every woman who ever tried to get close to him. Yet the moment a poor maid reaches out to them, the dogs stop growling. They wag their tails. They gently rest their heads in her arms, as if they've known her forever. Why would 2 animals trained to trust no one instantly choose her? Was it instinct? Or did they recognize a secret their owner had spent years trying to bury? You won't want to miss the mafia boss's fierce pit bulls bit every lady, but melted in the arms of a poor maid. Click on the next video, and I'll see you there.